Hi there, and welcome to this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Do you find that inflation is starting to beat you down? Are you looking to ways maybe, or are you considering perhaps a side hustle to bring in that extra income? Well, this is the show for you this week, folks. We've got a review of a recent article that's been very popular in Forbes magazine that tells you the 3 things you need to do before you do a startup. And as usual, this week's episode is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Menden Honolulu Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of this.
Wow, we got that going again. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So, it was so good the first time we decided to play it again. But let's start this week's show by telling you all about what it is and what the makeup is that you have to do if you want to consider a side hustle. Before we do that, let's talk about metaphors, because metaphors are pretty important. And that's what this article was all about on Forbes, Forbes.com. There were a series of articles that described what happened, how you were able to start these side hustles with 3 simple ways. We're going to go over those 3 simple ways in a moment. But again, let's take a step back and focus on what those articles each began with. They began with a metaphor. And a metaphor is a story, often in an allegory form. So an allegory is a form of a metaphor that sort of instructs you on what you can do to enhance your everyday life. It's supposed to give you lessons perhaps in a template form that you can then follow and apply to your life. And that's what this does. That's what this story does. And the story goes back more than 100 years into the late 1800s. It was a time in the post-World War era of America when people were focusing mostly on family, farm, and in fact, festivals. So here we have a picture of a typical Western New York community, open fields, family, farm. What you don't see are the festivals. And the festivals made up a very important part of American culture immediately following the Civil War. Actually, not immediately. There were some things that had to be done, but they grew in popularity as we got into the 1870s and the 1880s. These were very, very popular affairs. They were often sponsored by civic associations, as well as, believe it or not, railroads. Railroads would bring people to these events, cause people to pay money to buy tickets and go to these events. They could be fairs, carnivals, or even things like spas or picnic areas, relaxation centers, anything that would drive business on the railroad, to the railroad, that would bring people to these affairs. Now, most of these affairs were all-day events, and they often included, I should say, not only the typical things that you see in terms of, say, rides. Now, of course, we're talking about the 1880s. You see a Ferris wheel in the background. That Ferris wheel wasn't invented until 1892, I think, at the Chicago World's Fair. So this actually is a little bit later than the 1880s, but it gives you a sense for people going to these events. One of the more popular occurrences that happened at these places were horse races. And sometimes it was just the horse race itself that people would go out to. Another popular event wasn't just horses racing, but bicycle racing. And bicycle racing really happened all over the place. It was very, very popular, and that's where people went. So what else occurred at these exhibitions and these events that really brought people in? Well, obviously, you had the exhibitions themselves. People would show animals and win prizes on the exhibits that they would have, how well trained the animals were, things like that. You also had, besides these exhibits and contests, you had various forms of entertainment. Perhaps the most popular one were the acrobats, people doing crazy things in crazy ways. It was showmanship. It was the beginning of the whole circus idea, people going and having fun. It wasn't the beginning. This has been going on for a while. But within America, this really started to take hold. And I think that if you look at how this happened, it was, if you were a person living at this time, going to the events, you were going to make a day of it. That's how popular these things were. That's how much people were drawn to these fairs and expositions. So what are you going to need? If you're there all day, you're going to need something, and that something is pretty important. It's food. You're going to have to be able to eat while you're there. You can't just bring a bag lunch. Well, I suppose you could make it a picnic, but then, the first half of the day, you'd have to be lugging around this picnic basket, and the rest of the day, you still have to carry the picnic basket because you're not going to throw it away, although it might be lighter because you ate the food that was inside. No, it was a lot easier if you had something to eat that you could buy right there. And this became a fairly popular business, and it was something that really started off, grew. The food concession business grew. So now let's take a look. Let's shift angles for a little bit and talk about a couple of brothers that participated in this. Frank and Charles Menches, a couple of brothers from Canton, Ohio. They were very well into this whole outdoor experience in terms of entertainment. Charles was an acrobat, and he did acrobatic sort of things. There we go. He's got a little acrobat there that he's doing there, and he was pretty good at it. He did perform these at a very young age, and he was quite notable. He was mentioned several times in the paper, and it was a good job for him. Frank, on the other hand, was a bicyclist, and he was a bicycle racer. He was also very good at this. He won several bicycle races. Now, if you put these two things together, the acrobatics and the bicycle racing, you'll see that there's a couple of things you'll notice. First, with the acrobatics, it's kind of dangerous, isn't it? Look, you let go of the rope there by accident, and you're going to fall and you're going to hurt yourself. So that's not something that you necessarily want to bank your career on, if it were. Bicycling, the same thing. It's not so much that you could get hurt. Certainly you could get hurt in bicycle racing, but you bring in even less money than you would bring in as an acrobat. And the acrobat wasn't bringing in that much money at all. So this was primarily Charles' thinking initially, because Charles was the older brother by about 6 years. Frank was only in his teens when he was bicycle racing. By Charles' early 20s, he knew that he needed to do something. He needed a side hustle. He needed a way to make more money than he was making and do it in a safer way. So what he did was he looked around. He really enjoyed the carnival business. He really enjoyed the fairs and the expositions. What he wanted to do was try to find something in there that would generate more money than he was currently making and was safer. So he looked around, and what he saw was food concessionaires. If he could sell food, he could make money, more money than he was making. In fact, the food concessionaires made more money than everybody except for the promoters of the fairs themselves. Charles was in no way in a position to promote these fairs, to be the producer of these fairs at this point in his life. Later on, the brothers would produce fairs, primarily Charles, and circuses. But it was, at this point, they had to pick something that they could realistically do, and that was food. So they went and they followed the money. That's what they did initially. They went out and they looked for some place, some sort of product or industry that they could make more money on. And they saw, well, what are other people making money on right now? And that's kind of what lent them into this whole sense of going in and starting a food concession business. So that's the first lesson I think that you'll want to take away here. The M in your side hustle MVP is money. The first thing you want to do before all else is you want to find where people are spending money, because that's the easiest place for you to make money. You could have the greatest invention in the world, but if there's no market for it, you don't make any money doing it. Now, you could make an argument, well, what about these what about microwave ovens? There were no microwave ovens, when the microwave oven was invented. So, how are you going to know that people are going to buy microwave ovens? Well, that's kind of not true. It wasn't that there weren't any microwave ovens. There were ovens. There were vehicles which people made food. And you could see how they spent money on that. And you can convince them that the microwave oven would have them save money or, get some benefit from an existing product versus an existing product than they currently get. So you go where the money is. You find where the money. Now, there's other inventions that are really totally out of the blue if you go far back enough, or even today. I mean, microcomputers. How many people had computers in the 1980s when these things first came out? Very, very few. They had to make it themselves in their own garage. And it was something that you had to convince people that they needed. And it took some time and it took some effort. If you're doing a side hustle, you don't really have time or effort or energy to go ahead and try to convince a market to buy something new. So don't do that. Go exactly to where the money is. Find out where the money is. Find out all the different places where the money is. Be like Charles. Charles said, okay, I like this industry, this fair, exposition, circus industry. Where's the money there? So find the industry, find the area that interests you to begin with. Start there, and then go and find where the money is in that particular area. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about the V and the P of the side hustle MVP. But right now, we're going to take a break, and we're going to head to our normal commercial, assuming that it's here somewhere. So we're just searching around and just, this is a kind of an interesting way of doing things at the last minute. But here we go. We'll take a break right now, and we'll talk to you on the other side.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. "50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard." Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
All right, welcome back to this week's edition of the Greater Western New York, State of Greater Western New York Report. And if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to pop it into the chat, and I will take a look at it and see if any questions are there. There was one question here about how do I find the money? All right, so I think what the person is asking is they have their idea, they have their general area that they like, and now within that general area, What are they going to do to find out where people spend money? Well, it really depends on the type of business that you have. There are records, there are ways that people can go and look for the money. For example, if you go on Amazon, you can see which books are sold or which products are sold more popular, what are the more popular products. And you can determine how they, with books, it's a lot easier because they have a ranking system and you can see where they are. Other areas are just kind of anecdotal. Some people say, it's not the money, it's the market, it's the size of the market, it's the people. That's not necessarily true. That doesn't necessarily equate to money. But if that's the only thing you got, if it looks like there's a lot of people in this market and that they're actively purchasing, there's some evidence that they're actively purchasing. You might see articles about the products being written about in general very much, and that'll tell you that there's interest and that people are spending money there. So that's one way to find one. I really can't get into it unless I know specifically what industry you're in. That's kind of the advantages of what happens if you study stocks and markets all the time. You kind of know a little bit more about the industries and what's happening. So unless you're that kind of person, it's hard to know right off the top of the head. But basically, just Google that product, Google sales, Google revenues, things like that, and it'll help you identify maybe where people are spending money. So let's get back to the story of the Mencius brothers. Now, when we left them, they had decided that they wanted to get into the food concession business. So they had discovered where the money was. They earned their M. They're about to earn their V. The V stands for void. What's missing in the market? Now, they could go in and be a food concession sales and sell popcorn candy like everybody else. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't differentiate you. What begins to differentiate you is if you sell sandwiches. Now, popcorn and candy, everybody buys everywhere. That doesn't matter. But the sandwiches, you go to your favorite sandwich place. And everybody already had ham sandwiches. So it did nothing for them to sell ham sandwiches. They had to pick a type of sandwich that was different than everybody else, that wasn't currently being offered. It was still a sandwich, so it qualified in that category of sandwiches, but it wasn't what everybody else was serving. And so they picked a pork sausage sandwich. That's the V that's the void that they filled. That's how they earned the V of their side hustle MVP. They filled the void by selling pork sausage sandwiches. It's not just that, though. They had some technology advantages that their competitors didn't have. Because they were new, they had to buy new equipment. And they bought the latest equipment. The latest equipment were gas-fired grills as opposed to wood grills. The issue with wood grills is when you're burning the wood, it produces ash. And the ash can catch things on fire, whether it be people's clothing or wooden structures. And the fact that they had a gas grill actually gave them an opportunity. They filled a void that, in this case, the board of the 1885 Erie County Fair was looking to fill. The board was looking for food vendors who were not using wood-fired grills. Why? They had just built a brand new grandstand out of wood, and they didn't want to see it burn down the first year or so. So they looked for people who had gas-fired grills, and certainly the Mencius brothers had that. So they actually had two things going for them, two voids that they filled. The way that they cooked and what they cooked. So they cooked on a gas grill, and they used pork sausage to create the sandwiches. And that was great. That really put them ahead. It got their foot in the door, and it turned out that these sandwiches were fairly popular. Isn't that the sort of thing that every entrepreneur wants? You want your product to be extremely popular. So they got their M and they got their V. How did they earn their P? What is the P? Well, the P sort of stands for what happens to every single plan that you make. It always messes up somewhere. Something goes wrong, and you're forced to pivot. That's the P. You're forced to pivot from your original idea to a new idea. I mean, you can certainly give up, and that's what some people do, but the people who continually find success are the ones who pivot from the original idea and then make a variation on a theme that creates a new idea, and sometimes it's a better idea. And that's the case of what happened to the Mencius brothers. On the last day of the fair in 1885, Friday, September 18th, the Mencius brothers found out that they had run out of pork sausage. Their sandwiches were so unique and so popular that they sold out. And they had an entire day's worth of fair goers left. And remember, there were record crowds the day before. There's no reason to expect that there wouldn't be record crowds on this last day. That's when all the big events were. So you got to figure that people were going to be showing up. And their position by the grandstand made them all the more, say, likely to find a lot of business. These events, particularly the parade that ended the fair, really occurred in the grandstand. And when that was over, people came out right after lunchtime, and they were going to want to eat. And if you exit the grandstand with everybody else, you're going to look for the first place to offer food. And the Mencius brothers' stand was among those first places. So they had to find a way to get more pork sausage to make their sandwiches. Here's a problem. The butcher refused to sell pork sausage to them. The word was that the butcher said it was too late in the day to kill another pig, and he would not be able to sell the rest of the pig to people just to provide the 10 pounds of meat that Frank Mencius asked for. And the butcher said, well, why don't you buy this meat instead? And the meat he offered was ground beef. Now, at the time, ground beef was considered a very plebeian food. It was something that you just basically, you didn't eat in real life. If you ate it, it meant that you were sick. Literally, ground beef was used for medicinal purposes. There are recipes from that era that tell you how to make medicine-type food out of ground beef. President Garfield, as he was dying a few years earlier in 1881, he was fed ground beef. There's newspaper reports about how the doctors gave him ground beef in the morning to help him do something better, to help him get better. It didn't work. He died. But, that's the sort of thing that people were using ground beef for. So it wasn't very attractive to Frank, but he had no choice. He had to pivot. He had to use what he had available to him. So he brought it back, and they put it in the same sausage patties that they did earlier, except it was ground beef, not pork sausage. And they did some experiments, and they found out how to make it. And there's a whole story about how they tried several times. They failed. In fact, what I like to say is the first thing they invented was the hockey puck, because they burned the hamburger. It was black charcoal. The reason why they burned it is because their first attempt was good on the outside, but raw on the inside. So they tried to cook the inside. Well, the only way they can cook the inside is if they burn the outside. Got this black disc, and it wasn't cold enough to play hockey yet. But so what they did is they put some coffee inside, some brown sugar, because everybody hates the taste of coffee, and then some other things, and they made it taste good, and they got it to bake and cook throughout. They sold out again. So this new invention that they had, the hamburger, really hit a home run. And someone came up to Frank and asked him, what do you call this thing? And Frank said, well, we don't really have a name for it. He didn't really say that. That's not the way he told the story. He didn't say that. Well, we didn't have a name for it. What he said is, and he looked up and he saw a sign that said Hamburg Fair, because that's what the Erie County Fair was called. And he says, oh, this is a Hamburg sandwich. And a lot of people think that's too cute, that that's not really what happened. But in fact, newspaper articles from 1885 that talk about the Erie County Fair do say that when people came up to vendors, and the example they gave in the case that I'm thinking of was cheese, a happy customer came up, hey, this is great cheese. What do you call this cheese? And the vendor said, it's called Hamburg cheese. So that was certainly a naming convention at the time. But the name of the burger itself is not important. What is important is how the Mencius brothers pivoted from selling pork sausage sandwiches to selling hamburgers. And that's how they earned the final element of the side hustle MVP. So what is this? How does this allegory instruct you as you are going to go to create your own food? And let's just make sure we have no questions here. If you have a question specific to this, just put it in the chat and I'll read it. If you're going to be interested in maybe earning a few extra bucks on the side, a side hustle, so you're not going to quit your job to do it, you're just going to earn something. Well, you think about what people did in the Depression. They sold apples or pencils or things like that. They went to where the money was. People were willing to pay money to buy those things. So that's what they went. Again, the first thing you do is you go to where the money is. You find out, based on what your interests are, what you can do, where the money is, where people are spending money. And then you go to the next step. So that's the M. Then you go to the next step, which is the V. You find the void. So what can you offer that's different than everybody else? And it doesn't have to be a large magnitude of difference. Look at what the Menchus brothers did. They sold sandwiches. The general categories were sandwiches. They just sold a different sandwich. So they filled the void by offering a sandwich no one else was offering. So if everyone is selling a black car, what if you sell a car that has color in it? Going back to, the 20s and 30s when cars came out with more colors. So take a look at that. Do that. Create something that is different than anybody else. And depending on the product, it could be really easy to do that. If you pick a product that is dependent on your personality, you as a person, could be consulting, for example. That's the differentiator. Your combination and culmination of experiences really makes you different than everybody else. So that's an easy way to sell something, to fill a void. You just have to be able now to identify what those differences are and how it fills the void for your customer. So the V is the second step of the side hustle MVP. The last thing is the pivot. So the pivot is normally something associated with unintended consequences, something you can't control. It's most famously known for recently as the COVID pivot, because what a lot of businesses did back during the COVID days is they found that they could not sustain their current business model, their then current business model, because of the shutdown, because of what COVID was doing. So they pivoted. They did something different. Restaurants, instead of being eat-in, all of a sudden restaurants that did normally do this offered takeout or delivery. So there was that sort of pivot that kept you in contact with the customers, kept you engaged, kept you getting people to pay you for something. So that was a pivot born of necessity. What I would suggest is, as you say, get more experience filling the void with your product, your current product, is you say to yourself, you ask yourself, how can I pivot from that product? If I'm currently offering consulting, verbal consulting, going in and meeting with somebody, that's my side hustle. What can I offer that's sort of ancillary to this business? How can I pivot from just talking to somebody to creating a product that they'll buy? So your consulting might be talking to people. That's what your consulting is. But it turns out that your talking really can be reduced to templates or classes or something that is more of a self-contained product that doesn't require you to be there physically. I mean, this is another area which you get to in the area of capacity constraints when you're into business. That's very important. So if you decide and consider what possible pivots there are now, before you have to, you might be in a better position a few years down the road, whether or not you're forced to pivot, just because it expands your business line. Well, that's pretty much all that we have for today. There are no further questions on this. There is a site that you can go to actually get more information about this. But of course, I don't have it here. Oh, no. So what I'll suggest is that you just go to our normal site. Is if you want to ask questions and be a member of the live audience, go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and you will get our emails. And if you want to get some information on this, just send us an email and we'll send you the links when you do that. Maybe what I'll do is I'll post the link on both our website when this is rebroadcast so you can see it there. All right. Well, thank you all for being a part of today's show. Remember, if you aren't a member of the live audience, you can always watch it on our site, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. Otherwise, if you'd like to see it when it's re-aired every Sunday at 1:30. Like our Facebook page, and you will be notified when it starts to be broadcast on Facebook. Likewise, on YouTube, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, YouTube will notify you when the broadcast is airing. So that's all we have for today. Once again, thank you very much for being part of today's show, and we'll see you next week.